So as far as the election goes, I know those of you who I speak with online, who know about my pursuits here with the channel, may or may not be wondering why I haven't commented on it. And the reality of the matter is that it is there's too much crossfire going on. Both sides seem to be spinning the narrative, and no one really seems to be interested in kind of filtering out or sifting through the noise. There were over 24 lawsuits, apparently most of which, according to Giuliani, Swediani, he, according to him, most of those were not filed directly by the Trump team, I guess, but were filed by individuals amongst different counties, which doesn't really make. I mean, it makes sense as a whole in terms of the aggregate, right? From Giuliani's standpoint, if he can point to the many these other lawsuits as examples of what could be determined as voter irregularity, then I can see the point. But I don't understand. I don't I don't see why there would be a distinction, and if there was to be one to be made, why that would matter in the long term. Because you'd think if you're both arguing from a legal standpoint for the same outcome or for the same thing, then you would want you'd want to announce each other's efforts. But I digress, because that's not the point of this video. The point of this video is that post-election, what we've seen is an immediate lockdown advocacy. And across the board, although Joe Biden himself has spoken and has said that he said initially that there won't be a national lockdown. Then he said he's going to support the science and that there won't be a national lockdown. And when you say those things in the same sentence, it's kind of oxymoronic, because if the science says to suggest to lock down, then he's going to lock down, contradicting the previous statement of I'm not going to lock down. That's why doublespeak is fun, especially in politics. But this is what's happening. The final Thanksgiving travel crackdown. Vermont will interrogate students over holiday plans. NYC sets up more checkpoints, and LA lengthens quarantine as cities and states across the country try and stop the huge getaway at the 11th hour. That's right. What's interesting? I was actually looking at Gallup, and Gallup poll here. The latest one taken and on the 11th of November shows that less than half, just 49%, slightly less than half of America actually supports another lockdown than what we had back in March, just 9 months ago or so, and I'm sorry, 5 months ago, and no, 9 months ago, 6 months ago. No, because it's November, not October. Wow. We're not gonna comment on that. The point is, however, is that you're seeing a great disparity from when lockdowns initially began at the start of March. And by the way, the virus was first detected in December at the end of the year in China. So we've been dealing with this for almost a year now, worldwide, and the lockdowns have done nothing to encourage people's idea of effective quarantining. Don't worry about that. We're seeing that the CDC recently talked about they are going to curtail a bit of the quarantine suggestion rate. So originally it was 14 days. They're going to curtail it to 7 to 10 days. So you're seeing this kind of revision of how in the medical community, this revision of how they perceive the virus. The problem is that people are not necessarily reacting as they would like. And so as the virus continues to spread, despite the death rate not necessarily growing with the infection rate, you are seeing a rapid infection rate, a second wave occurring that is faster than the first wave. It's much more prolific than the first wave, and seems to be affecting demographics that originally were not. And by the way, when I say affecting, I mean infecting. We're not seeing an increase in the death rate. It's something like 2.4% out of the I think 18 million total. We still only have like 250,000 deaths or something like that, which still, like, all life matters. But I'm just trying to give context here as to what it is that we're reacting to, right? The disease is dangerous because it's new, not because of what it is. The type of disease that it is, we've seen before. It is a coronavirus, one that we're not one we're familiar with. It's novel, but we are familiar with the family of viruses here. Cold and flu are of the same variety. Upper respiratory infection, head cold, things like that. For older people, flu is also a death sentence for the elderly as well. So it isn't like we're not used to that either. The whole issue is that it is new. Our bodies are not used to it, and this will take time for us to acclimate to. I was going to do a video on DC Council. The DC Council recently voted to conduct conduct vaccinations on children, on teenagers without parental permission. And this is coupled with, I was going to couple it with the discovery of the dosage amount that they're using for the vaccination trials right now, AstraZeneca and Pfizer. The only way they ended up finding out what the appropriate dosage amount to use was by accidentally giving people too much in the beginning. They gave them 2 full doses. It's 2 doses. They gave them 2 full doses instead of a half of a dose, and then a full dose in the second round. So it just, I'm getting way ahead of myself here, but what you're seeing now that the election is seeming more and more to solidify, you're seeing governors make moves, you're seeing pharmaceutical companies make moves. Everyone seems to be making moves in regards to Biden's election, except Biden. But he's assembling his cabinet members now, which are like former DuPont members. He's got a former DuPont member that's going to be working for the Environmental Protection Agency, which is great. I forgot his name, but he was able to help DuPont defend their position when they came under fire for what's called their forever chemical, which is something like C8, and stays in the body, causes cancer. You know how this goes. But I digress. Let me get to this. States are introducing curfews, short-term stay-at-home orders, and increased COVID-19 checkpoints to try and crack down on Thanksgiving travel. In LA, air travelers are required to acknowledge the state's recommendation that they complete a 14-day quarantine. In NYC, checkpoints at points of entry to the city will remind travelers of the state's requirement for quarantine and testing. It's not too bad. Vermont Governor Phil Scott called for the students to be interrogated and about their Thanksgiving plans before being allowed back to in-person teaching. Pennsylvania and Maryland are ramping up law enforcement patrols. New Mexico has a 2-week stay-at-home order, whereas in Minnesota, a blanket ban altogether has been placed on social gatherings. Period. Most states are relying on residents to comply with the recommendations rather than moving to enforce them. Millions are expected to travel for Thanksgiving despite the CDC warning of the threat of heightened coronavirus spread, which again couples with the idea that they are reducing their recommended length of quarantine time. I can understand why people would be given the contradicting information and action. I can understand a bit of confusion on the part of people, but it's not hard. What you've seen from the CDC, from the World Health Organization, which at one point talked about how lockdown should not be the primary method of quarantine, but people took that as like, oh, they're against quarantines and lockdowns. It's like, no. The fact of the matter is that if they need to be used, if it comes down to that, then it should be that. But you cannot utilize them as a primary method because we've seen both the psychological, mental impact and the economic impact above all else. We've seen over 100,000 restaurants across the country close. We only have something like 600,000, 700,000 restaurants. So a sixth of all dine-in restaurants are gone now. I cannot count the number of small businesses that have failed despite the PPP program. States are introducing curfews, setting up COVID-19 checkpoints, and issuing stay-at-home orders as officials hope to avoid a spike in coronavirus cases linked to Thanksgiving travel at the 11th hour. Yet millions have already traveled, packing airports and train stations across the country in defiance of the CDC's guidance. The approach to the Thanksgiving weekend and the travel crackdown have varied dramatically in different states. In Los Angeles, travelers into the city's airports will be required to fill out a form acknowledging the recommendation to quarantine for 14 days. After arrival, while in New York City, extra COVID-19 checkpoints have been set up at bridges and tunnels to warn travelers of the quarantine requirements. In Pennsylvania, Governor Tom Wolf announced that law enforcement would be stepping up efforts to enforce the state's safety plan, which requires people entering from a different state, whether Pennsylvania residents or not, to test negative for the virus within 72 hours before they arrive in the Commonwealth. In Maryland, High visibility compliance units will patrol to ensure no large gatherings. And in New Mexico, a statewide stay-at-home order has been issued to dissuade travelers. Wow. In many states and major cities, however, health officials are simply relying on the general public to comply with the recommendation to stay at home and avoid mixing with other households, rather than bringing in any measures to enforce the advice. In New York City, there was a gathering of 7,000 Hasidic Jews for a wedding, and then I think they were fined like $50,000 or something. I'm not entirely sure, but there have been increased patrols and crackdowns. That's in New York City. That's why I find it funny they say in major states and in many states and major cities, and it's like, but Los Angeles, but New York. But that's all right. There's only two. Vermont. Governor Phil Scott remained worried about Thanksgiving travel in Vermont Tuesday as he called for students to be interrogated about their Thanksgiving plans before being allowed back into in-person teaching. He directed schools to as teachers. He directed schools to as teachers. Did that twice. He directed schools to his students if they had been a part of a multi-family Thanksgiving gathering, requiring those who have done so to transition to online learning for 14 days. I know what we are telling Vermonters to do right now. To give up spending time with family and friends and family members is difficult. And I also know how done we are with this pandemic, added Vermont Health Commissioner Dr. Mark Levine, according to WCAX. In New York City, checkpoints at bridges, tunnels, and other key crossings will have cops out in force to inform travelers of the state's quarantine requirements. Travelers into New York are required to have a negative test before arriving, and then again 4 days into their trip. If that's negative, they can stop quarantining. The rules don't apply to neighboring states, and New Yorkers who are out of state for less than 24 hours only need to take a coronavirus test within 4 days of returning to the state. It's massive enforcement. Test and trace tests will also be out in the city to help travelers with the rules, authorities said. De Blasio said Tuesday, we're going to make sure that people are reminded constantly throughout the whole holiday season that if you travel, there are very clear rules that you have to follow. You're going to see the presence of the city of New York when you travel, particularly through our sheriff's office. You're going to see that there are really clear rules to be followed and that they will be enforced. Those who violate the rules face a fine of $2,000. What are you doing in Los Angeles? Ahead of the holiday, Los Angeles has now introduced an online form like that in NYC to ask air travelers to acknowledge that there is a recommendation for 14 days. Okay, states with restrictions for travelers. New York and California are among the few states that have asked travelers from out of state to quarantine. Alaska, Connecticut, D.C., Maryland, Massachusetts, and Hawaii require quarantine unless a negative test can be shown. Illinois has a color-coded system that indicates whether a traveler needs to obtain a negative test or quarantine. I wonder if the color codes, how does that work? A color-coded system that indicates whether a traveler. So you go to the airport to travel, and they give you a bracelet indicating whether or not you've been tested, so that when you arrive at your destination, I see. Kansas has quarantine restrictions in place from travelers from the Dakotas. That specific? Kentucky has a 14-day quarantine recommended in place for Alabama. Kentucky has a 14-day quarantine recommendation in place for Alabama. I guess what they mean is for people from these states. In Maine, all travelers must quarantine apart from those from New Hampshire and Vermont. Money. New Hampshire and Oregon also have a 14-day self-quarantine in place. So, we're seeing a massive uptick. Now, obviously, part of this is because the holiday season is coming up. But I think that the attitudes on the part of the governors, because most of these states are democratically run, or rather, they are run by Democratic mayors, governors. I think the attitude has shifted very much in solidarity and support of massive lockdowns, despite American approval for it really waning, despite the economic impact of it. And that's politics really as usual. What you will see is sort of what kind of a mix of the actions that Trump took. So at first, Trump wanted to be heavy-handed and command the state governments, right? He basically wanted to use the executive power from on high to force state governments to, whether it be open up schools, open up businesses, so on and so forth. Then when he realized he didn't really have the power necessarily to do that, he went to encouraging the states to take care of the issue themselves. Basically, it's one of these things where, well, you didn't want my approach, so now everything is on you, no matter what it is that the issue may be. So then you saw the governors at a state level then have to go to the president and say, hey, we need more help, we need more money, etc. And what ended up happening is this back and forth that left Yeah. So now what you're seeing from the Biden administration is a total hands-off approach that essentially leaves states to do as they please with no one to contend with, right? So when states go into lockdowns, they won't have someone who, in the case of Trump, will threaten to like withhold federal funding, will basically go to bat over particular measures that are being implemented on national television. They don't have to worry about any contention. So you will probably see a lot more full throttle, full spectrum measure implementation of lockdown procedures and types, despite what constituents and what polling shows. So we'll see. Please like and subscribe, and share the video, and be well. Happy Thanksgiving, and happy birthday, Mom.